Okie dokie, second doll time. Pestilence. I decided to not go with Venus here due to a couple reasons. First being the discoloration in the forearm. I also didn't quite like the mould on her hands or her ears. So we'll save her for another project. First we'll start with prepping the doll, taking all the clothes off, and clipping the hair as close to the scalp as we can. We'll soak her head in warm water so we can pull the head off of the body. And then pulling out the hair plugs from inside the scalp. And finally removing all of the factory paint from her face and her head with pure acetone. I'm not sure if this was some sort of factory malfunction, this thick line of hair plugs across her scalp. I want Pestilence to be some sort of evil scientist concocting illnesses in a laboratory somewhere. I also want it to be very like mushroomy and poisony. So I'm going to be cutting away part of her face and having growths come out of it. And this is just me sketching where I don't need to replug. Here's the colours I'm going to be using for her reroute. I'll put what actual colours they are and where I got them below. This is the first ever plug I've done. Yay! Took a little bit of time to get into the rhythm of doing this. And this is about 50% of her head done. Just look at how the colours are looking towards each other. White at the front to separate it from the green, and then fading into a dark green at the back, and then that yellow sickly stripe where her head's going to be cut away. And here's her reroute all done. I'm going to be keeping her hair long, like she doesn't care about her appearance and it's very unkempt. Drags on the floor behind her. Now, I didn't glue the hair in place at this point. I thought a much better way of doing that is to be cutting away the face and then gluing, which is what I'm doing here. Now that part of her face is away, we can glue that much easier before moving on to cutting the rest of her face. Moving on to some resin work and creating some accessories for her. Some lab bottles that I'm going to be filling with mushrooms and eyeballs and various creepy things. The first cast was alright, but there are quite a few air bubbles in it. I then tried what you're seeing now, casting one side and then the other, but I couldn't get the two to line up correctly. So trying a couple more times, I did end up with a very good cast. I also made some jars that I'm going to be filling with things as well. Just some clips of me making all the different pieces I need to assemble them. And here we have all the finished pieces. And a final thing while I have the resin out, casting her smiles. They're yellow, sickly, glow-in-the-dark eyes that give her a lifeless look. Next is the first group of sculpting clips. To start, I'm creating bark on her leg, working the texture with lots of different tools. I'm then going to be using this to add table mushrooms to later on. Secondly here, I'm going to be creating groups of fungus that are going to look like some sort of growth on her. Here I'm making tiny wire frames out of jewellery wire, which I'm then going to add a little bit of sculpt to make tiny bugs. Once dry, I use some tools to scratch some details into the body of the bugs. The final thing I did in this first round of sculpting was make the mushrooms for her little chemistry jars. While the sculpting was setting, I moved on to making her white lab coat, which I knew was going to be tricky because I've never sewn anything before. Well, except from a few fixes on a few clothes. I've never followed a pattern and I don't know any of the types of stitches mentioned, so I had to look everything up. The pattern I found, which I'll pop credits and links to below, also needed editing as it was for a bigger doll. I've cut out a lot of the footage of this process because it took a very long time. I also cut up a few old socks to use as mock-ups. Socks are pretty handy for dolls, as later on I also use one to mask her hair while doing her face. Anyway, here's the rest of the coat process. It does need a few tweaks, but overall I'm very happy with the outcome, and I actually really enjoyed sewing, so expect to see a lot more of hand-sewn things in the future. Once the sculpt is dry, it's time to paint. Starting with a base coat and then adding shading, followed by some dry brushing of greens for moss. Paint the buggies. I had to give the mushrooms a couple layers to build up an opaque base. So for the remaining parts I did a coat of white first. For these growths / groups of fungi, I gave them the colour scheme of the death cap mushroom. I thought this made them look pussy and sickly, something I'm going to be adding to later on as well. Painting her little flask mushrooms, here I went for the good old classic fly agaric. And the final part of this section of painting the inside of her head black. Moving on to her face. I wasn't aiming for pretty or a makeup look, as that would have gone against the rest of her unkept design. I wanted a sunken face, discoloration and a general grimy look. It took a few attempts to get this right, so here's a few clips of me trying in different methods. I also did this before setting her eye to avoid the sealant getting on it. I also added some pastels on the rest of her body to continue that grimy look. Next, a check of the eye to make sure it looks right before I set it. Kind of looks like she sees into your soul. Here I am also starting the modelling on the inside of her head. Starting with a little bit of epoxy, I'm then going to start placing in little half spheres that I made out of resin, which will also glow in the dark. These are kind of to look like little sores, little bloody pustules on the inside of her head. And of course, a few more table mushrooms. I also added more of these little groups of fungi to make it look like they were spilling out of the side of her face. I'm now adding the stems. Is it stems, mushrooms? Anyway, I'm now adding the stems for where I want some more mushrooms inside of her face to be. I'm also roughly positioning the caps to make sure they're the right size. I take them off to paint them, it's easier, and then I can put them back later. And here's everything painted. I'm just going to pop off my light and give her a quick charge under the UV to show you what she looks like glowing. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go with glue or resin here. I ended up going with resin because it's less likely to deteriorate over time. I'm using it and just placing it very sporadically to give a sort of oozy look over those pustules. Also adding a bit of a wet, shiny look onto the mushrooms. I add the caps back onto the mushrooms and move on to what seemed like a part that never ended, adding the moss and vines to her. I didn't plan where anything would go, just add till I was happy, and so here's an assortment of clips doing just that. I'm not sure who I originally took these shoes off of. They were blue. I used them because the heel looked like bark, and the front, which are chains, look viney when painted green. And I cut the top off one of them to fit the leg, the bark and the mushrooms on. Amanita also came with this little hair clip. I decided to paint it in the colours of the corpse flower because corpse, death, sickness. Amanita is also a corpse flower herself, so it made twice as much sense to paint it this way. I decided to try something different and add eyelashes. I really like the way this looks, so expect to see this again in the future. This is the dress that Amanita came with. It has leaves and vines on it, so it fits perfectly with the theme. Here I am just distressing it so I can add more moss and vines to it. Here I am, making quite possibly the tiniest part of this entire project, some very tiny eyeballs that I'm going to be putting in one of her chemistry jars. Here's a clip of one of the finished chemistry jars. This is my favourite one out of all of them I've made. To finish off, I made a little utility belt to hold the tiniest chemistry flasks I made. And the very final thing is distressing her lab coat by cutting, dry brushing, and you guessed it, more moss and vines. Firstly, I know I need to learn better ways of displaying these pictures. I'm still learning editing, so bear with me. Secondly, all I want to do is brush Pestilence's hair. It's such a mess, but I know I need to keep it that way. I absolutely love how she came out. The glowing is just so supernatural and ominous and eerie. I think there's just enough vines and moss on her. The colours, the placement, her lab flasks, I wouldn't change any of it. And I'm still in shock with how well the lab coat came out. So overall, I am extremely happy with the outcome of this doll. The only thing I would criticise is her face up. A combination of experience and bad sealant, it just didn't turn out the way I had imagined. Not to say that I'm unhappy with the results, I just think this is a skill that I need to focus on in the future. Let me know what you think about Pestilence down below, and I'll see you in the next video.